The morning Colonel Antoine Dubois rode onto the damp grounds of the Beauchamp estate began just like any other unforgiving dawn for Cora. The thick Louisiana sun had not yet breached the horizon when she was already on her feet, her bare toes pressing into the cold, packed dirt of the scullery floor. Madame Delphine possessed a specific, cruel vanity, having decreed long ago that a housegirl without a surname was not even worthy of the thin Spanish moss mattresses out in the slave quarters. Cora slept wedged between the massive cast-iron stove and the drafty back door. She always woke before the roosters, intimately aware of the heavy price that came with waking after the household stirred. In that sweltering March of 1868, deep in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, the plantation grew sugarcane out in the sprawling fields and harvested pure humiliation within the walls of the big house. Madame Delphine maintained the illusion of southern gentility with terrifying precision. Whenever the circuit preacher arrived for Sunday service, she would drape a pristine white cotton kerchief over Cora's shoulders, flashing a saccharine smile to the neighboring planters as though she were the most benevolent mistress in the parish. She would claim Cora was a blessing from the Almighty, her pale fingers gripping the young woman's arm hard enough to leave deep purple bruises beneath her dark skin. She would declare she simply did not know how the estate would function without her, and Cora would smile back, a hollow, rehearsed expression, because it was what she was ordered to do. Since she was a little girl, she had learned that silence brought far less pain than the truth. She was only 18, yet she carried the exhaustion of a woman twice her age. She wore a patched homespun dress, her coarse hair wrapped tightly in a tignon, exactly the way her mother had taught her before being sold off down the river to a distant Natchez cotton operation when Cora was barely 6. Cora had calloused hands and a perpetual weariness in her eyes. But buried deep within her ribs burned a stubborn ember that no amount of degradation had ever managed to extinguish. On that particular morning, Cora was kneeling beside the heavy wooden wash trough in the yard, scrubbing linens with lye soap, the harsh chemical scent rising thick in the morning mist. She did not bother to lift her head when the heavy thud of horse hooves echoed up the oak-lined drive. But then she heard a sound she had never encountered before. Madame Delphine's voice, stripped of its usual venom, sounding breathless, submissive, and almost gentle. She welcomed Colonel Dubois, her tone dripping with uncharacteristic warmth, begging him to step onto the gallery. Something shifted in the heavy air that day. Cora slowly raised her chin, risking a fleeting glance through the thick tangle of oleander bushes that separated the washyard from the grand porch. A man had dismounted from a massive chestnut stallion and was standing on the gallery steps, engaging in quiet conversation with her mistress. He was a towering figure with broad shoulders, dressed in attire that sharply contrasted with the decaying rustic pretense of the Beauchamp estate. He wore a crisp grey felt hat, meticulously polished leather riding boots, and a dark frock coat that marked him as a gentleman accustomed to commanding respect wherever he tread. He appeared to be in his late 30s. His face was weathered by the relentless Delta sun, but his features were chiseled and unyielding, anchored by a square jaw and a piercing gaze that stripped away all pleasantries. This was Colonel Antoine Dubois. Cora had heard the whispers in the quarters. He was the master of Oak River, one of the most prosperous and sweeping sugar estates along the river, a man of immense wealth and an ironclad reputation. The hushed rumors said he was a grieving widower, having lost his young wife to childbed fever 2 years prior. Ever since that tragic night, he had run his vast lands with the cold, mechanical rigor of a man who believed he had absolutely nothing left to lose. There are moments in a life when the very earth beneath a person's feet alters its rotation, when the heavy hand of fate turns a page in your story without bothering to ask for your permission. That was the precise, terrifying weight Cora felt pressing against her chest in that singular instant. What she could not possibly fathom was that the silent, imposing man standing on Madame Delphine's porch was the opening chord of a life she would never have dared to conjure, even in her most desperate, feverish dreams. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, cutting straight to the point as he addressed the mistress of the house. He mentioned that she had sent word regarding someone who might be of use to him. He needed a woman of absolute trust to care for his infant daughter. The child had been robbed of a mother far too soon, and he required someone with the temperance to educate, to protect, and to nurture. Madame Delphine nodded with frantic, exaggerated enthusiasm, resembling a starving hen that had just stumbled upon a handful of cracked corn. She eagerly offered her up, praising her as a tireless, obedient housegirl who knew how to sew, cook and tend to infants, promising the colonel he would not regret the transaction. Cora felt her stomach violently twist. Madame Delphine was bartering her away like a barrel of molasses, driven by the same cold commercial hunger. The colonel's command was simple and absolute. Bring her to the porch. Madame Delphine's voice cracked through the humid air of the yard like the snap of a bullwhip, summoning Cora at once. The young woman frantically wiped her soaked hands on her burlap apron. She could feel her knees trembling beneath her skirts as she walked toward the gallery, her eyes fixed firmly on the wooden floorboards, the standard posture of survival before strange white men. Yet, she kept her spine perfectly straight. Her mother had instilled in her the unbreakable truth that while they could strip a woman of her freedom, they could not take the dignity of her stride unless she surrendered it. Colonel Dubois studied her in absolute silence for an agonizing stretch of time. Cora could feel the physical weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her shoulders. When he finally spoke, he asked her age. She answered softly but clearly, telling him she was 18, keeping her tone completely respectful. He asked if she possessed the ability to read. Cora's breath hitched in her throat. Old Mama Cecile had taught her the alphabet in secret, tracing letters in the ashes of the quarter's fires. Madame Delphine had no idea. Cora took a profound risk and admitted that she could. When asked if she knew how to care for a child, she simply answered yes. A profound quiet settled over the porch. The colonel turned his towering frame back toward Madame Delphine. He announced he would take her, and bluntly asked what price she demanded for the girl's manumission papers. Manumission. The word fluttered into Cora's ribcage and settled over her battered heart like a dove that refused to fly away. The two of them haggled over the price, but Cora's ears were ringing so loudly she could not make out the sums. When the deal was struck, the colonel looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were the color of dark molasses, serious and burning with pure determination. He ordered her to gather her belongings. Cora shot a desperate glance at Madame Delphine, holding on to a foolish shred of hope that the cruel woman might suddenly refuse to let her go. But Delphine only offered a satisfied, reptilian smile. She was ridding herself of a burden and lining her pockets in the process. Barely 20 minutes later, Cora found herself perched behind the saddle of Colonel Dubois' chestnut horse, clutching a miserable, tightly bound cloth bundle. It contained nothing but a spare, threadbare dress and a string of wooden prayer beads Mama Cecile had carved for her. As the decaying plantation faded into the distance, Cora did not shed a single tear. A person does not weep for a place that was never a home. Yet as the horse carried her down the dusty river road, a suffocating terror gripped her throat, a paralyzing fear of the unknown, a fear of the silent man riding before her, and a fear of whatever dark fate awaited her at Oak River. Women born into her station did not get to choose their destiny, and right now her destiny bore the name of Antoine Dubois. The journey lasted nearly 3 excruciating hours. Cora did not utter a single syllable, and the colonel offered no conversation either. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic thud of hooves against the packed dirt. Cora watched the landscape shift dramatically. The neglected, overgrown fields of the Beauchamp property gradually gave way to meticulously manicured pastures, vibrant green rows of sugarcane, and lines of field hands laboring under the blazing sun while an overseer watched from horseback. Cora's heart ached at the sight. She technically held her freedom now, a folded piece of legal parchment tucked securely in her bundle. But she was intimately aware that freedom written in ink and freedom breathed in the world were two entirely different realities. When Oak River Plantation finally rose into view, Cora forgot to exhale. It was a magnificent 2-story Greek revival mansion. Its wide whitewashed walls gleamed in the sunlight, crowned by a slate roof and surrounded by a sweeping wraparound gallery supported by massive fluted columns. The tall windows were shuttered in a rich, dark green. Symmetrical flower beds, overflowing with sweet-smelling jasmine, and climbing tea roses dominated the front lawn, casting a fragrant, welcoming perimeter that reached all the way to the main road. The colonel finally shattered the 3-hour silence, simply announcing their arrival. He swung down from the saddle with the effortless grace of a man who had practically been born on horseback and reached up to help her dismount. Cora hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his. His palm was massive and heavily calloused, conveying a deep firmness that completely lacked brutality. It was simply strong. The moment her bare feet met the gravel, a woman materialized on the grand porch. She was short, stout, and deeply authoritative. Her silvering hair was pulled back into a severe, uncompromising bun. She wore a neat, dark calico dress protected by a spotless white apron. Her shrewd, narrowing eyes swept over Cora from the tignon on her head to the dirt on her toes, wearing an expression that was entirely unreadable. The colonel climbed the steps, calling out to her. He introduced the woman as Aunt Odette, commanding her to show Cora to her quarters and explain the daily routine, stating she was hired to care for little Claire. The older woman crossed her thick arms over her chest, muttering that the girl looked terribly small and far too fragile for the work. The colonel cut her off instantly, stating with absolute finality that she would manage just fine. He instructed Cora to follow the house mammy's orders, and without another word, he turned his back and strode purposefully toward the sprawling stables. Cora swallowed the heavy lump of anxiety lodged in her throat and followed Aunt Odette into the cavernous, immaculate depths of the big house. The central hallway was vast, its wide plank floors polished to a mirror shine. Halfway down the corridor, Cora froze. She was stopped dead in her tracks by an oil portrait hanging on the wall. It depicted a stunningly beautiful young woman with dark, cascading curls and a radiant smile that seemed to have captured the sun itself. Aunt Odette paused, her tone softening slightly as she explained that this was Madame Evelyn, the colonel's late wife, who had perished bringing baby Claire into the world. She dropped her voice to a harsh whisper, adding that the master had died right alongside her, leaving only a ghost to run the plantation. Cora felt an inexplicable sharp pang in her chest. This was a man fractured entirely by grief. Cora's new room was located on the second floor. It was small, but meticulously clean. It held a narrow iron bed, a modest wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the sprawling orchards and the winding curve of the bayou in the distance. Cora carefully set her meager bundle on the mattress and simply stared. A bed, a room with a door, her own space. Aunt Odette gruffly advised her to thank the master, noting that most planters would have shoved a newly freed girl into a damp shed out back. He had explicitly demanded she be kept close to the nursery. Her duties were clear: bathe the child, brush her hair, nurse her through sickness and earn her keep. Cora respectfully agreed. The older woman grunted, seemingly satisfied that Cora wasn't prone to backtalk, and ordered her to wash her face and report to the kitchen before meeting the child. The outdoor kitchen was a massive, detached brick building, radiating intense heat from the open hearth. The air was thick with the rich, intoxicating aromas of simmering gumbo, fresh-baked cornbread, and boiling chicory coffee. Aunt Odette unceremoniously shoved a tin plate piled high with buttery grits, cured ham, and a cup of warm milk in front of Cora. She barked at her to eat, noting her sickly, thin frame and accurately guessing that her former mistress had starved her. Cora defensively murmured that she had been fed enough. The old woman let out a cynical snort. She had seen the bruised, scarred flesh on Cora's arms. She leaned in, her voice low and fiercely protective, promising Cora that as long as she worked hard and loved that baby, she would be treated with the dignity a human being deserved. Colonel Dubois did not tolerate cruelty under his roof. Just then, a thin, piercing wail drifted down from the upper gallery. Aunt Odette wiped her hands and signaled Cora to follow. As they climbed the grand staircase, Cora's heart hammered furiously against her ribs. When the heavy oak door swung open, she laid eyes on the little girl who would permanently alter the trajectory of her soul. Claire was standing upright in her mahogany crib, her knuckles white as she gripped the rails. Her face was flushed, her cheeks slick with tears. She had a mop of dark, unruly curls and massive, devastated brown eyes. She was clutching a faded patchwork ragdoll to her chest, as if it were a life preserver in a stormy sea, sobbing uncontrollably for her papa. Aunt Odette gently informed the weeping toddler that her father was out in the cane fields, but introduced Cora as her new nursemaid. Claire stared at the stranger with the deep, wary suspicion of a child who had seen far too many faces come and go in her short life. Cora slowly sank to her knees, bringing herself down to the little girl's eye level. She spoke in a hushed, melodic tone, complimenting the doll and asking for its name. The child gave a wet sniffle and mumbled that the doll was named Odette. The old mammy behind them let out an exaggerated theatrical gasp of offense. Cora slowly extended her arms. The toddler hesitated for a long moment before leaning forward. The second Cora gathered the child against her chest, she felt the profound, radiating heat of that fragile little body. Claire smelled faintly of lavender soap and the salty dampness of her own tears. Cora began to sway back and forth, humming a deep rhythmic spiritual her mother used to sing in the dark of the Natchez quarters. Slowly, the tension drained from the little girl's limbs. She rested her heavy head against Cora's collarbone and released a shuddering sigh like a weary traveler who had finally found her way home. Watching from the doorway, Aunt Odette's harsh features softened, and a rare, genuine smile touched her lips. The rhythm of life at Oak River moved at a pace Cora had never known. She woke with the dawn, but not out of a primal terror of the lash. She woke because little Claire would be babbling in the adjoining nursery, calling out for her father or singing nonsensical melodies to the morning light. Cora spent her days bathing the child, wrestling a brush through her wild curls, and chasing her through the formal gardens where the little girl shrieked with pure joy as she tormented the peafowl roaming the grounds. When night fell, Cora would rock her to sleep, singing those same old Creole lullabies, songs woven from French dialect and West African rhythms that sounded like a sacred blessing in the shadowed room. And as the toddler drifted off, Cora would sit by the crib, acutely aware of a terrifying, overwhelming warmth expanding in her chest. It was a fierce, protective love that had kicked down the door to her heart without bothering to knock. Colonel Dubois remained a constant, brooding shadow over the estate. He left the house before the fog burned off the bayou and rarely returned before supper. Yet some nights, just before Claire fell into a deep sleep, he would slip into the nursery. He would hold his daughter against his broad chest in absolute silence. Cora would always respectfully retreat to the hallway, but one evening, through a crack in the door, she heard him weeping softly, whispering to the child that she was the only anchor keeping him tethered to the earth. In that shattered, private moment, Cora realized that Antoine Dubois was not a man made of stone. He was a man who had intentionally paralyzed his own heart to keep from bleeding to death. If the heart is prone to stumbling, to losing its rhythm when confronted by shared grief, then the unfolding months were a slow, beautiful catastrophe. Cora came to realize that the Colonel's calculated distance was not a symptom of indifference. It was an act of desperate restraint. As the humid Delta spring bled into a sweltering summer, a quiet, unscripted bond began to form between them. Cora acclimated to the scent of boiling sugar that blanketed the estate, the distant, mournful songs of the field hands cutting cane, and the comforting crackle of the massive kitchen hearth where Aunt Odette reigned supreme. Most importantly, she acclimated to being loved by a child. Claire now followed her everywhere, affectionately calling her CC, having decided that Cora's full name was entirely too long for a 2-year-old to manage. Every night, the child would grip Cora's fingers through the crib slats, begging her never to leave, and Cora would promise, with every ounce of her spirit, that she was there to stay. For the first time in her brutalized existence, Cora belonged. She was no longer a piece of nameless property sleeping on a dirt floor. She had an identity, a purpose, and a child who adored her. But she was also fighting a desperate internal war, trying to suppress an emotion she had no legal or social right to entertain. It was growing wild and unyielding, like river reeds pushing up through the mud. She was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with Colonel Antoine Dubois. It was not a sudden, violent spark. It wasn't the dramatic lightning strike the older women used to whisper about while sorting cotton in the fading light. It was a slow, quiet accumulation of unguarded moments. It was the humid afternoon he returned from a business trip to New Orleans, handing Aunt Odette a parcel of fine linen for Claire, and then, almost as an afterthought, awkwardly holding out a bolt of beautiful sky-blue cotton. He wouldn't look Cora in the eye, gruffly muttering that the mammy had complained about her threadbare dresses and that she needed proper clothes. Cora's hands trembled as she took the fabric. When he turned to leave, she noticed the heavy tension in his shoulders subtly relax, the posture of a man who had done exactly what he wanted to do, despite his better judgment. The tipping point occurred when a brutal late summer fever swept through the house, seizing little Claire. Cora spent 3 agonizing days and nights pressing cool, vinegar-soaked rags to the child's burning forehead, her fingers white-knuckled around her mother's wooden beads as she whispered frantic prayers. The colonel abandoned the fields entirely. He sat rigidly on the opposite side of the crib, his face a hollow mask of exhaustion and the silent, suffocating terror of a father who knew exactly what the Reaper looked like. When the fever finally broke just before dawn, and Claire sank into a deep, healing sleep, Cora slumped against the floral wallpaper, her eyes sliding shut. Suddenly she felt a heavy, comforting weight drape across her shoulders. It was the colonel's own wool riding coat. He stood agonizingly close, his voice thick with gravel and unshed tears, softly commanding her to rest while he kept the watch. In the dim, flickering light of the oil lamp, Cora looked up at him. She could trace the dark, exhausted circles beneath his eyes, the rough shadow of a 3-day beard, and the agonizing vulnerability etched into his face. She whispered her gratitude. He gave a slow nod, but he didn't step back. For a lingering, breathless moment, they simply stood together in the quiet nursery, bound by the sheer terror they had just survived and the overwhelming love they shared for the sleeping child between them. That was the exact second Cora knew her heart was entirely lost to him. But life on a wealthy Louisiana sugar estate did not afford space for forbidden affections. There was a woman, a wealthy aristocratic widow from a neighboring parish named Genevieve, who had taken to visiting Oak River with alarming frequency. She was draped in imported Parisian silk, always arriving with a basket of candied pecans or fine embroidery, her predatory sights locked firmly on the grieving colonel. Cora made herself scarce during these parlor visits, but Aunt Odette missed absolutely nothing. One afternoon, while viciously pounding out dough on the flour-dusted kitchen table, the old woman hissed that the widow cared only for the Dubois land and the sugar profits, lacking a single ounce of genuine warmth. When Cora quietly replied that the master's business was not her concern, Odette leveled a razor-sharp glare at her, calling her a foolish girl who refused to see the blazing fire burning right in front of her own eyes. The true breaking point arrived on a stifling, cicada-loud evening in late June. A grand political gathering of regional planters was taking place at a neighboring estate, and the colonel was obligated to attend. Widow Genevieve was expected to be draped firmly on his arm. Left behind, Cora put Claire to bed and wandered out onto the darkened rear gallery, staring out over the moonlit bayou. The silence of the delta was vast and consuming. She marveled at how drastically her life had changed, from sleeping near a stove to sitting on a grand veranda, yet her heart remained a greedy, foolish thing, aching for a man she could never possess. A sudden voice shattered the quiet, asking why she wasn't asleep. Cora jumped, spinning around to find Colonel Dubois standing in the shadows of the doorway. He was still in his fine evening wear, but his cravat was violently yanked loose, and he looked deeply agitated. Cora hurriedly stood, stammering that she hadn't expected him back so soon. He walked over to the wooden railing, gripping it so hard his knuckles shone white in the moonlight, admitting he couldn't stomach another minute of the gathering. The arrogant boasting, the endless talk of sugar yields, and the widow Genevieve shadowing him like a debt collector had finally driven him mad. Cora's pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her throat. She carefully noted that the entire parish believed he needed a new wife, and that Claire needed a mother. The colonel turned to face her. The emotional armor he wore so perfectly during the day had entirely dissolved. He stared intently at her, asking if she truly agreed with the parish gossip. Caught off guard, Cora deflected, stating it wasn't her place to have an opinion on the master's life. He took a deliberate step closer, his voice low and intensely sharp, reminding her that she was a free woman now, and he was asking for her mind, not her servitude. Cora looked away, watching the silver moonlight dance on the dark water of the river. She finally whispered that Claire already had someone who cared for her, someone who loved her fiercely. The colonel closed the distance between them. He asked, his voice barely a breath, "What about the rest of it?" He was so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, inhaling the masculine scent of damp earth, fine tobacco, and leather that always clung to him. He spoke her name with a desperate reverence. He confessed that he had tried to fight it. He had tried to convince himself she was merely the nursemaid, repeating the lie every morning. But then he would see her laughing in the gardens, or hear her singing in the dark, or catch her staring out at the stars when she thought she was completely alone. Cora stopped breathing. Antoine Dubois, the master of Oak River, confessed his love to a freedwoman under the Louisiana night sky. He admitted he didn't know when the fever had taken him, acknowledging the sheer madness and social peril of his feelings. He knew she was young and free, with a whole life ahead of her, but the truth was tearing him apart. A heavy, terrifying silence fell between them. Cora felt hot tears welling in her eyes, not of sorrow but of an overwhelming, dammed-up emotion finally breaking through the levee. When she spoke his name, her voice trembled. He begged her to call him Antoine. She tested his Christian name on her lips, feeling the immense gravity of the syllables. She looked up into his dark eyes and asked if he honestly believed he was the only one suffering from this affliction. She confessed that ever since the night he had laid his heavy coat over her shivering shoulders, she had carried him in her heart. She had tried to disguise it as gratitude, to bury it under respect, but it was love. A terrifying, unasked-for love she didn't know how to survive. Antoine closed his eyes, absorbing the profound weight of her confession. He took the final step, bringing his large, calloused hands up to cradle her face. The gesture was heartbreakingly tender, as if he were holding something infinitely fragile. He leaned in, and Cora rose onto her toes to meet him. The kiss was a quiet revelation, a desperate, reverent promise that dead things could bloom again, that two profoundly broken people could forge a fire in the absolute dark without pretending their scars didn't exist. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. He demanded absolute certainty from her. If they crossed this line, there would be no half measures, no shadows. He wanted her by his side. He wanted her as his wife to stand openly before God and the parish, damn the consequences. Cora did not hesitate. She told him she was more certain of this than anything she had ever known. Antoine smiled, a brilliant, unburdened smile that transformed his entire face. In the heavy, jasmine-scented air of the gallery, they forged an impossible pact. The path forward was violent and steep. The antebellum aristocracy of the Delta recoiled in horror. The news that the wealthy Antoine Dubois intended to exploit the new Reconstruction laws to formally marry a freedwoman of color tore through the river parishes like a wildfire in a dry cane field. The whispers were vicious. They called it an abomination. They accused Cora of using dark Creole root work to bewitch him. But Antoine refused to flinch. He walked her proudly down the center aisle of the parish church, his hand gripping her elbow, broadcasting his defiance to the world. When a wealthy neighbor dared to question Aunt Odette in the market, the old mammy leveled a stare that could curdle milk, declaring that if the gossips had half a brain, they would realize Antoine Dubois had secured the finest woman in the entire state. Widow Genevieve, however, was not content to merely gossip. On a suffocatingly hot afternoon in July, her opulent carriage violently crunched to a halt in the Oak River Drive. She stormed onto the gallery, demanding an audience with Antoine. Cora was halfway up the main staircase with Claire when she heard the vicious exchange. Genevieve screamed that he was making himself a laughingstock, destroying his legacy for a girl with no name and no bloodline. Antoine's voice rumbled through the foyer, low and dangerously calm. He informed the widow that Cora possessed a purity of heart she could not begin to comprehend. She loved his daughter, and she loved him for the man he was, not the acreage he owned. Genevieve shrieked that he was blind. Antoine's roar shook the crystal chandelier, ordering her off his land and threatening ruin if she ever returned. The widow spat a venomous curse and stormed out, slamming the heavy door behind her. Cora slowly descended the stairs, finding Antoine leaning heavily against the cypress wall, his head bowed. When he looked up, the vulnerability in his eyes shattered her. He whispered his fear that the widow was right, that his selfish love was tethering her to a life of endless social persecution. Cora walked straight up to him, taking his large, trembling hands in hers. She forced him to meet her gaze, fiercely declaring that she chose him. She didn't stay out of necessity. She stayed because he was the man she wanted, the father Claire deserved. A single tear tracked through the dust on his cheek as he whispered, he didn't deserve her. Cora offered a sad, tender smile, telling him that perhaps he didn't, but they were in this fight together now. The wedding was set for late August, a quiet, defiant ceremony held in the small Catholic chapel on the estate grounds. It was attended only by the priest, Antoine's loyal brothers, a fiercely weeping Aunt Odette, and the freedmen who worked the land. Cora wanted no grand spectacle. She only wanted the man, the child, and the family they were forging. But a mere 3 weeks before the vows were to be exchanged, a ghost from Antoine's shattered past arrived to tear their foundation down to the studs. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Cora was in the summer kitchen, helping Odette prepare a massive pot of jambalaya, when heavy knocks rattled the front door. The old mammy went to answer it, returning moments later with a pale, deeply unsettled expression. She carefully told Cora there was someone asking for her. The sheer dread in the old woman's voice sent a violent chill down Cora's spine. She wiped her hands and walked out to the grand foyer. Standing in the doorway was a frail, exhausted-looking Acadian woman in her early 30s, wearing faded, dust-covered clothes. Her dark hair was braided down her back, and her eyes held the frantic, cornered look of a woman who had run out of options. Resting on her hip was a toddler, a little boy no older than 2, with a head of thick, dark curls and round cheeks. The strange woman looked at Cora, her chest heaving with a mixture of terror and fierce maternal determination. She asked if she was speaking to Cora. When Cora nodded, the woman took a deep, shuddering breath and delivered a sentence that caused the polished floor to drop out from beneath Cora's feet. She introduced herself as Marguerite and stated that the little boy in her arms, Thomas, was the biological son of Colonel Antoine Dubois. Cora's entire universe collapsed. She stood paralyzed, her eyes locked on the little boy. He had Antoine's exact eyes, that intense, dark molasses stare, and the unmistakable square cut of his jaw. The betrayal hit Cora like a physical blow to the ribs. She managed to choke out a single fractured question. Marguerite took a desperate step forward, tears spilling hot and fast down her weathered cheeks. She swore she never wanted to come, but she was entirely destitute and her son deserved to know his father. She explained in a rush of panicked words that it happened 3 years ago, during the darkest days of Antoine's grief following his wife's death. Marguerite had been working at a rough tavern down in the French Quarter. Antoine had been drinking himself into oblivion. They were 2 broken, desperate people seeking a moment of comfort. By the time she realized she was with child, Antoine was long gone, buried back in his plantation. She had married a kind riverboat worker who claimed the boy as his own, but a boiler explosion had taken his life 4 months ago. She was facing the street, and she sobbed that little Thomas bore no sin in any of this. Cora felt a tug at her skirt. Little Claire was standing there, staring up with wide, frightened eyes, demanding to know why her Cece looked so sad. Cora's voice sounded entirely foreign to her own ears, as she gently instructed the child to go find Aunt Odette. The old mammy materialized, sweeping the confused girl away. Cora turned her devastated gaze back to Marguerite, asking if the colonel even knew the boy existed. Marguerite shook her head, admitting her cowardice, but claiming desperation had forced her hand. Heavy bootsteps echoed on the porch. Antoine strode through the front door, stripping off his riding gloves. He froze the instant he registered the scene. His eyes locked onto Marguerite, and the blood drained so completely from his face he looked like a corpse. He whispered her name, the sound hollow and distant. Marguerite sobbed an apology, telling him he needed to look at his son. Antoine's gaze dropped to the toddler. Then he looked at Cora. The absolute devastation in her eyes broke his legs. He collapsed onto the wooden bench in the foyer, burying his face in his hands, begging God for mercy. The hours that followed were a suffocating nightmare. Aunt Odette, utilizing her fiercely practical brand of love, quietly ushered Marguerite and the child out to the guest cottage, providing them with a hot meal and a bed. Cora locked herself in her bedroom. Her first instinct was a blinding, white-hot rage. She wanted to tear the house down. But the rational survivor's voice that had kept her alive through her darkest years reminded her of the cold facts. This happened before he even knew her name. He hadn't known the child existed. She paced the floorboards, fighting a brutal war between her shattered pride and her deeply rooted faith. And then her mind settled on little Thomas, 2 years old, carrying Antoine's eyes in a strange place, entirely innocent of the sins of the adults who brought him into the world. Cora remembered the spirituals Mama Cecile used to sing about grace, a grace so vast it could swallow the deepest betrayals. When Cora finally emerged, the sun had set. The hallway was completely dark save for a single candle. Antoine was sitting on the floor outside her door, his back against the wall. He looked as though he had aged 20 years in a single afternoon. He scrambled to his feet, frantically begging her to let him explain. Cora simply stated she wanted to speak to the boy. Antoine blinked, utterly bewildered, asking if she was certain. Cora looked at him with a steely, sorrowful resolve. She admitted she was certain of absolutely nothing. But the boy possessed his blood, which meant the child was now their shared responsibility. Antoine broke down, his broad shoulders shaking as he wept, choking out that he did not deserve her grace. Cora offered a tragic, beautiful smile, acknowledging that he probably didn't, but they had to play the hand they were dealt. Cora walked out to the guest cottage. The little boy was asleep. Marguerite leaped up from her chair, bracing herself for the wrath she assumed was coming. Cora gestured for her to sit, demanding the absolute, unvarnished truth from the very beginning. Marguerite wept as she recounted the sordid, tragic tale, a grieving planter, a desperate tavern maid, a single night of shared misery, and the good husband who had raised the boy until tragedy struck again. Cora looked the woman dead in the eye and asked if she harbored any love for Antoine. Marguerite's answer was fiercely absolute. She loved her late husband. Antoine was a mistake made in the dark. She swore on her life she had no intention of usurping Cora's place in the big house. She just needed her son to survive. Cora studied the woman's haggard face. There was no malice there, only the unique, hollow exhaustion of a mother trying to keep her child from starving. Cora took a deep, fortifying breath and delivered the decree that would define the rest of their lives. She told Marguerite that they were staying. Marguerite gasped in shock. Cora placed a protective hand over her own stomach. She had missed her courses and realized only a week prior that she was carrying Antoine's child. She explained that Thomas was Claire's brother, and the brother to the baby currently growing in her womb. Under her roof, family did not get cast out into the mud. Marguerite would be given work as a seamstress. She would earn her keep with dignity, and Thomas would know his father. The only demand was absolute honesty and total respect for Cora's marriage. Marguerite fell to her knees, grasping Cora's hands, sobbing her gratitude until her voice gave out entirely. When Cora returned to the big house, Antoine was pacing the parlor. He stopped dead, his eyes frantic. He slipped, calling her Evelyn in his panic, before violently correcting himself. Cora let the agonizing silence hang in the air for a long moment, a deliberate judge weighing a sentence. Finally, she informed him that Marguerite and the boy were staying, and that he was going to be a father to Thomas. Antoine closed his eyes as a profound, ragged sob tore from his throat. Before he could speak, Cora's voice turned to iron. She warned him that if he ever kept another secret, if he ever breached her trust again, she would leave, and she would take Claire and the child growing inside her. Antoine's eyes snapped open. He stared at her hand resting on her abdomen, absolute shock mingling with a joy so fierce it looked like agony. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, dropping to his knees and pressing his face to her stomach, wrapping his arms around her waist. He swore an oath to God and the saints that he would never lie to her again, that she was the salvation of his ruined soul, and that he would spend the rest of his days proving his worth. Cora looked down at the powerful man weeping at her feet. She saw his genuine remorse and the terrifying depth of his love. She made the conscious, excruciating choice to forgive him, not because it was easy, and certainly not because it didn't hurt, but because she understood that true love wasn't a pristine, untouched thing. It was the grueling, deliberate choice to build a home on fractured ground because you implicitly trusted the mortar holding the bricks together. She pulled him up from the floor and held him in the dark parlor. letting him cry out the years of grief, guilt, and loneliness he had carried for so long. She gently reminded him with a wry, tearful smile that he still had to explain the situation to Aunt Odette, and the old mammy was going to show him zero mercy. Antoine let out a wet, genuine laugh, admitting he was terrified of the prospect. 10 years later, in the golden autumn of 1878, Cora sat in a woven rocking chair on the sweeping gallery of Oak River, watching the sunset bleed vivid shades of violet and burnt orange across the sugar fields. She was 28 years old, a woman entirely transformed from the terrified, enslaved girl who had arrived with a threadbare bundle. Her hands still bore the faint, silvery scars of her past, but the work she did now was born of choice and devotion. She possessed the profound serenity of a ship's captain who had navigated a brutal hurricane and learned to cherish the calm waters. She was a mother of 4. Claire, now a fierce, opinionated 12-year-old, called Cora Mama, with an easy devotion that required no prompting. Thomas, the unexpected son, ran wild through the pecan groves alongside James, the dark-eyed boy Cora had carried in her womb during the storm. The two boys were inseparable, bound by a brotherhood that cared nothing for the complicated sins of their conception. And then there was little Sarah, a vibrant 5-year-old who believed the entire plantation existed solely to serve as an audience for her singing. Marguerite lived peacefully in the renovated guest cottage, operating a successful dressmaking business, forever honoring the boundary she had sworn to keep. She was simply a thread in the complex, beautiful tapestry of the family they had violently forged. Antoine stepped out onto the gallery, his footsteps heavy and familiar. He took the chair beside hers. The thick hair at his temples had turned a distinguished silver, and the delta sun had carved deeper lines around his eyes. But the way he looked at her remained as intense and reverent as the night he first confessed his love. He asked her where her mind had wandered. Cora leaned her head against his broad shoulder, musing on the bizarre, terrifying grace of the universe. She marveled at the journey from sleeping in the dirt to presiding over this sprawling, chaotic, deeply flawed family. Antoine pressed a soft kiss to her crown. He murmured that he didn't believe in accidents. He believed that every lash she had suffered, every tear she had shed, was a brutal road meticulously paved to lead her straight to his door. He believed his presence at the Beauchamp estate that specific morning was divine providence. Cora smiled, lacing her fingers through his. Down in the garden, Claire was teaching little Sarah how to weave crowns out of jasmine vines, exactly the way Cora had taught her a decade ago. The boys were wrestling in the grass, their laughter echoing over the bayou. Through the open kitchen window, Aunt Odette's low, soulful humming drifted out, a timeless melody of survival. And sitting under a magnolia tree, Marguerite watched her son with the quiet, contented smile of a woman who had outrun disaster. This, Cora realized, was the true architecture of love. It was not a pristine, unblemished fairy tale. It was a raw, living thing constructed from forgiveness, grueling choices and second chances. It was the radical faith that salvation was possible even when the world tried its hardest to break you. Antoine suddenly broke the quiet, his voice thick with emotion. He told her that when they were both long gone and buried in the delta soil, he hoped someone would tell their story. He wanted the world to know about the enslaved girl who arrived with nothing but wooden beads and conquered an empire with her grace. He wanted them to know about the family built on the ruins of a broken man's pride. Cora turned to look at him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. She promised him that the story would survive. She knew that tales of such impossible survival existed to remind those trapped in the dark that there was always a way to navigate back to the light. There was always a chance to begin again. Antoine squeezed her hand, whispering that there was always love. Cora echoed the sentiment, pulling him into a slow, deep kiss as the final rays of the sun dipped below the tree line. The children continued their games, and the eternal, indifferent flow of the Mississippi River kept moving, carrying away the suffering and leaving behind the quiet grace of a life fiercely lived. Decades later, when Cora was an old woman with snow-white hair and hands mapped by a lifetime of labor and love, she would sit in that exact rocking chair and gather her grandchildren at her feet. They would sit on the polished floorboards, their eyes wide with wonder, asking if the legends were true, if she really had slept in the dirt, if she really had arrived with nothing, and she would offer them a smile that held the entire weight of her history, the agony, the forgiveness, and the overwhelming triumph. She would tell them it was all true, but point to the sprawling estate and the family surrounding her. She would pass down the ultimate lesson, urging them never to surrender to the darkness, because a love forged in the fire is infinitely stronger than any chain meant to bind them, and those children would carry that fierce truth in their bones, passing it down through the generations, until the true history of Cora Dubois shed its mortal skin and became the enduring legend of the Delta.